Good morning. Welcome to Rockefeller. My name is Eric Pawlowski. I am the Vice President of the Global Economic Recovery Program at Rockefeller. We're very honored to have you here today. But more importantly, we're very honored to have the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley of Barbados, and the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed of the United Nations. We do this every meeting of the IMF World Bank because we feel compelled by the world and the crises it's currently facing. We do this because we know that you are the community of action. You are the opportunity, and you are the pathway to change. And so we've brought together an incredible array of leaders on these crucial issues to try to outline for us how to make all of our actions unified and effective. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lord Alok Sharma to introduce the DSG.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And can I just start by saying that you all know this, that we live in an incredibly fractious and uncertain world. But there are three things that are absolutely certain. The first is the impact of the chronic threat of climate change is getting worse, year by year, month by month, day by day. The second is the countries that are most vulnerable are least equipped to deal with this issue. Many of them are suffering a debt crisis. And the third is that the scale of the finance that is being deployed for climate and development does not match in any way the scale of the challenge that we face. And that's why the work that Rockefeller has been supporting, that Prime Minister Mia Mottley has been leading on the Bridgetown agenda, is so vitally important. Can you still hear me? Yes. I'll speak up. We're 19 days out from COP29 in Baku. Now, I know there are people who are thinking whether people should or shouldn't go to Baku. I would just say this, that every COP builds on the last one. And I think it's important to be there, to hold governments and leaders to account. And just remember that if we don't get things agreed at one COP, it just moves forward to the next year. We haven't actually got a year to waste. This is also going to be the finance COP. We've got to agree this new finance goal. And I hope that what we come up with is ambitious, but also realistic. Just remember how difficult it was to reach that 100 billion figure. But then what we need to see layered around this public finance goal is all the other elements of finance, particularly private finance. And I do think, personally, this is a personal view, I think we need to talk about who contributes. And thirdly, of course, the finance piece is vitally important. But at this COP, we mustn't forget mitigation and adaptation. You know, the world agreed at COP26 that we would phase down coal use. We agreed last year in Dubai that we would transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. Well, the world's got to deliver now. I mean, there are countries out there that think what they agree in an international forum is a pick and mix. It's not. It's all on the menu. You've basically got to get it all done. And I think the final thing for me is fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, to me, it's pretty bizarre that we sit in these sort of forums and we discuss climate and development finance at the same time governments collected around the world providing trillions of dollars a year in explicit and implicit fossil fuel subsidies. So look, I hope leaders will rise to the challenge in Baku, but we have two leaders here who have always risen to the challenge: the Prime Minister and the Deputy Secretary General. Now, I'm supposed to introduce Amina. I mean, look, you all know her, right? She's been an inspirational figure for years, and I'm not going to read her CV to you, but I will give you a personal story. When I was first appointed as COP President Designate, the first trip I did was to New York, and I came to see Amina. And this was supposed to be a half-an-hour meeting, and we started as a one-to-one session. It went on for 2 hours. And she sat there giving me probably the best advice that I've had at the start of this work that we were doing on COP. Really detailed, objective advice. And she's always been there since. and I hope you won't mind me saying this, Amina, but I do regard you as a big sister. And frankly, the world right now needs lots more inspirational big sisters. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce the Deputy Secretary General, my big sister, Amina Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Alok. I'm glad you didn't say grandmother or anything like that. Big sister's good. But thank you so much. I mean, first of all, to our colleagues at Rockefeller, and secondly, to all of you, because you come every time. And when you see Amina Mohammed on the agenda, I wonder why. But you do come, and it really does matter, because everyone in this room has got a day job that matters so much to influencing the power that should be acting today to try to resolve many of our problems. And it's not that we can't do it, but somehow we haven't been able to connect everything. And I'm not going to say we haven't done anything, but it is great to be here off the back of the General Assembly. And I want to give a big shout out to many of the familiar faces that I'm seeing here, but including Prime Minister Motley. She's my sister in crime. And we do an awful lot together, but her voice matters so much at the GA. We always say that it is the voice of the smallest states that perhaps make the most sense and have the most urgency with what we have to do. But also many who were part of the negotiations in getting us the ambitious outcome that we got. And in a world where we are fractured and where we are continuing to polarize, if you listen to the debates about each of the meetings happening this week, from the World Bank meetings to what will happen at the Biodiversity COP, to the BRICS meeting in Russia, to the G7 meeting, and then to Samoa. There's not a good story in any one of them. And I think that that sort of just tells us how difficult this is. But that negotiated outcome of the pact in such a time, give credit to what we got in it, because much of it was much better than many of the other platforms in months before who had communiques. And I do want to thank many of you in the room here, but I am going to shout out for another sister, Alexia. Thank you so much for the work that was done to get that done, because it was more than a technical negotiation. It was also a political one, and that's why this group is so important. What's bringing us together this morning, again, it's a common reality, and I'll continue to say that, look, what happens in these rooms is nothing like what is happening out there. Climate is unrelentless. In a country that I come from, Nigeria, we never imagined we'd have the kind of climate catastrophes, and they touch you far and they touch you near. I lost my primary school went underwater when the rains were so heavy in our part of the country that the dam broke. And it took 2.5 million people out of their homes, and they're still out of their homes because the water has not receded. When it does, we continue to find bodies of families, and it's horrible. And I can speak to that, but then, yesterday my son was sending me one of the videos and said, look, our factories in Lagos are underwater, and where he worked was underwater. So it's very real in everyone's life, and climate doesn't know any borders. And we've been listening to small island states for years, but now it's coming to big ones. And I think this matters that, we are struggling to make that happen. But it's also about the SDGs. And the SDGs, when we came in 2015, we said that this was the way to deal with all of development, and it was sustainable development. But 17% of those targets on track. You see that in countries. I was in Sudan, in Chad, 2 days ago in Ethiopia. It's not working. People are getting poorer. And the social unrest that's coming with it is not coming with old people. It's coming with populations of 60, 70% young people. That in itself is a catastrophe. Hunger is rising. And we're just hearing now with Alok the fossil fuel use and global temperatures also soaring. And our conflicts are spreading, and why wouldn't they? When there's no hope out there and there's a lot of frustrations, conflict, it starts from the home. GBV rates are way up. But in communities, the way that society is fracturing along ethnic, religious, and it goes on and on and on until we get huge, massive unrest and conflicts. The fight for gender equality is floundering. Why wouldn't it? We have Beijing Plus 30 coming up next year, and I go back tomorrow to New York to sit in the Security Council and talk about women, peace and security. These are all failing because we haven't invested in the root cause. We continue to talk about the Band-Aid, and even less so with less urgency. And we are seeing that from 2015, when we had some hope with our developing countries and developed converging in their incomes, today, of course, there's a huge divergence and inequality is growing massively. We're seeing a third of our poorest 75 countries, poorer than they were 5 years ago, just 5 years ago. So we know that this can't go on. That's what's bringing us here. We know that financing has been at the core of this. We knew in 2015 that financing was at the core. That's why we got the Addis Ababa Agreement, and that's why we will have that discussion again in Spain in June next year. The finance gaps are large and growing, and much of this is debt service. When I heard from the Prime Minister of Ethiopia what he was paying in debt servicing over the last 5 years, what he could have been doing with that if he had the opportunity to invest would have been huge. And that wasn't just, that's just what he was paying and what he didn't expect to pay, because there have been situations that have exacerbated this around the world, back from COVID, Ukraine, and inflation there, and of course much higher debt servicing, and a debt framework that has not worked as quickly as it needed to in a response to countries. And I think that that's what we have to underscore, the urgency and the response to countries, so that we stop them going over the cliff. We're seeing economies finding themselves repeatedly thrown off course. Again, the external shocks that the global financial system is unable to contain, and it will get worse. It doesn't get better, it gets worse. But today, I'd like to talk about the change that's within our reach. The past 9 months, as I just said earlier, we had discussions on the financial architecture, many initiatives, and really the initiative that the SG put on the table for an SDG stimulus a few years ago was after COVID, and we were just basically trying to get a message across to finance ministers. How did we talk about development to finance ministers? It's the same challenge we have today about talking to them on climate. But I think, the SDG stimulus, I think it set off a whole lot of conversations, and perhaps the most powerful of those initiatives, which is on 3.0 now, is Bridgetown, because it was growing to the response. It was growing to constant discussion that we were having of what was impossible and making it possible, and more responsive. And so thank you, Prime Minister Motley, for that. And I know that you'll speak to a few of those issues that we carry on. But we did have a difficult set of circumstances, geopolitical tensions and the regional conflicts. Still, the heads of state came together, did what they had to do, and that was get the pact out. But today we see some backtracking on the pact. And so it's really important that this instrument that we have, where heads of states agreed, the inner workings of our institutions have got to grab what we can and move. And why? Because it's about 8 billion people. And the 8 billion may not be below the poverty line, but they will come in harm's way, all of them, if we don't take care of the bottom half, which are struggling every day. And once they see no hope, then we're all at risk. So the pact really has got very specific actions there that raise voice and representation. But it does talk to, I would say, 4 major areas. It's our let's get the SDGs done. We've got, 5 years to go. There is a countdown. There's plenty to do in the SDGs. Just tell me what's not in them. This is such a comprehensive agenda. But you have to look at it country by country and see where the gaps are and what we need to do. It's an investment agenda. It's not a charity one. That investment has to happen in a number of areas, and one of those we will talk about today in energy and getting to those 300 million people in Africa. But it's more than that. It's about food systems. It's about connecting people. It is about the energy piece. It's about social protection, climate, which is not going away anytime soon. And of course, it is for us about the number of institutions that we can strengthen to sustain this and to deliver the scale at which we are speaking about. So finish the SDGs. The next 3 were really about putting some wind under the wings of the SDGs. One was ensuring that you had more peace and less conflict. And that's needed for every country. There is not a country that has an unconstitutional change or terrorism or conflict that can begin to deal or create the enabling environment for investments. So we've got to deal with peace and security at the same time that we are trying to encourage those investments and use what we can of domestic resources better to get to people and to get to the environment. So that second piece on peace and security is important, and there are many strands there to take up. The second has been about this new era of technology, and it's always about who's going to get left behind. I think it's about who's going to take the courage to put the investments in to leapfrog, because there's so many things we don't have to go through anymore with the event of this technology. We took up AI, put some guardrails around it. It will work, but it needs to work together. It needs to work as the opportunity, and not what will be the downside of it if we're not careful, but on education, on jobs, on connectivity for financial service or extension workers. There's so much good in it. Could we invest in that? And I think that although it seemed like we were going to have a real fracture in the negotiations on new technology, I think we came together at the last minute and look at what it has in there. I think it's useful. Last but not least, this is for this week. It is about the international financial architecture. And we've spoken about an architecture that was designed for a different era and one that we need to talk about for today's needs and the responses that we have to have. You all know what we want to put on the front. On the top of the agenda, reforming the institutions is one thing. It's a political ask and it's going to be tough. But there are things with what we have that we can do. We can resolve these debt issues. It's not difficult to do it. We've done it before and we can do it again. We have the COP coming up. It is a finance COP. And if we can't agree what we're going to do, at least with the core, it sends signals to COP30, where we're supposed to produce plans for climate, which will be our NDCs 3.0. In UAE, I think pretty historic. I still scratch my head as to why we did it, because it's such a big lift. To have an economy-wide NDC is not a joke. I don't know which finance ministers have really rolled up their sleeves to see the implications of an economy-wide NDC. The macroeconomics of it, the sectors that have to be involved, governments that are there for a short term that have to turn around on a sixpence, parliaments that have to understand that this is going to go beyond their committees. This is massive. And then you have to tell communities what this is going to imply. So that's a big ask, but it will need funding and it needs it up front. So if COP29 doesn't give the signals, we will not get NDCs 3.0 that will reduce emissions, which, by the way, I understand our reports are telling us are going up and not down. So really important that we try to get that right. We've talked about access, long-term concessional funding to countries that need it as an investment in their development. And I'll continue to underline this. It should not be so difficult. It shouldn't be difficult because we do have money going into some of these countries, but it's really expensive. And that we have to find a way to de-risk many of the ways that we are being evaluated. And I don't know, we've spoken to credit rating agencies until we're blue in the face, and maybe we will start to get some oxygen and they will be more helpful to telling us what more we need to do so that countries can have long-term concessional financing to get their job done. It's not that we haven't done it before. At least I can say from the UN's creation, it was actually never to have a war again. It was about we the people. And when you see the kind of financing that went out to rebuild some countries, in one case, they only just finished paying 3 years ago. So long-term concessional, we know. Why not for the rest of the world? What's the incentive for us to take everyone? Because I'm not sure that I've been able to succeed in talking about people and talking about climate because we've been doing this for a decade or more. So what are the incentives that people will want to invest in the 8 billion and not just in 1 or 2? We have to find answers to that, and it will affect us in the end. I'm more anxious about the new technology that will come, because I don't think that we should fear people coming across as migrants or refugees out of Africa across the sea, because actually they've drowned. Nothing changed. But I don't know that with climate, new technology will also cross borders, and the controls on that will be little or nothing. I can tell you from my country, when we started to do this, no one could stop us doing what we were doing. I wish we would put that energy that we did into fraud, into actually productive sectors, and then we would have been the greatest in the world. But when people have no hope, when they see no future, and they have this amount of energy and innovation, new technology will not be so good. And so I think now's the time. We have a reset moment with the pact. Let's do what we can to get this job done, and to get it done starting from financing where it can be done. Start from climate financing. It's not different from development, because we're saying, let's be on the right side of history and do all the investments that we need for adaptation. But most of what I see us investing in terms of industries is actually being on the right side of history. So difficult conversations this week. I think my parting shot to you all is that we need to continue to have these conversations. We need to continue to be a little bit more specific about what we want out of each institution. This is about the people who are working in the engine rooms of our institutions. The leaders have done what they need to do. They've given you the remit to do it. But we need to message to our institutions internally, from these levels all the way to the ground, in our country teams, in our country offices, on how to get this done, how to partner with our developing countries, whether it's a small island developing state or it is a low-income country, landlocked country. I mean, whatever nomenclature we want to give, it is over 3 billion people that need some help right now. And not for want of trying. They will make the efforts. They're full of energy and they want to do it. It's for us to try to make this work, and I think that we can do it. So my messages are, the pact was honored, in that we got the best ambition we could. Now it's up to us to lift it, to get the SDGs done, and so much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General. Thank you, Amina. We appreciate those important comments. And I do want to take a moment just to recognize that Amina has been extraordinarily consistent with this point of view for many, many years. And when she says political leaders have offered the space for those in this room to lead, I read that as a call to action, that we in this room can be bolder, we in this room can be more focused, we in this room can be more urgent about turning the political commitments into actual on-the-ground reforms at this meeting, at the upcoming COP, at the upcoming IDA convening. So let me just say thank you for that, and I'd also like to just welcome Danish State Secretary Lotte Macon for being with us. Thank you. Assistant Secretary Alexia Latortu, thank you for being here. World Bank Vice President Aki Nishio, and African Development Bank Vice President Kevin Kariuki. I don't see you, Kevin. Oh, there you are. Hi, how are you? Welcome. Welcome to the Rockefeller Foundation. We are excited to host you, and it's my job to introduce the Prime Minister. But I do want to just highlight that 2 years ago, the Deputy Secretary General and the Prime Minister invited us broadly to Bridgetown during the summer, during a music concert called the Crop Over Festival, to both enjoy Bridgetown and to do some real roll-up-your-sleeves work on what is a bold enough agenda of institutional transformation that could actually meet the moment that Amina just described needs to be met. And since those 2 years, since that extraordinary convening, which launched Bridgetown 1.0, there's been a Bridgetown 2.0. There is now, we will hear from the Prime Minister, a Bridgetown 3.0. Important reforms have taken place, and important steps forward had been had. But when you measure it up against the spirit of what brought us to Barbados that summer, there are anti-government protests in 83 countries. 1 in 5 people are malnourished and hunger is going up. 117 million people have been forcibly displaced in 2023, up from 59 million in 2022. 10 years ago, there were net inflows from through ODA and its various aligned resources into developing economies of about 225 billion. This year, we will have net outflows of 50 billion. Think about that, a $275 billion delta across a decade. 48 countries are spending more on debt interest than they are on educating and providing health care for their people in their countries. So in that context, we should celebrate the steps forward we've made, and we should certainly celebrate the next speaker, who is a true moral voice, and a moral voice for change and transformation, backed by actually doing it at home, backed by stellar performance in putting these concepts into practice, backed by an extraordinary political popularity for serving everybody in that nation and in similar nations around the world, and backed by a couple of years and more of running around the world. I think the Prime Minister is leaving this afternoon to a far destination to make the case that the time to put these policies in place is now, and that the political space has to continue to get bigger to make that possible. And so Prime Minister Mia Mottley, our next speaker, we should celebrate her leadership. We should recognize the unique and powerful nature of her moral voice. But perhaps more than all of that, for those of us in this room, we should actually just listen to what she's saying and try to do it in our day-to-day. If you're an ED at the World Bank, go in there and get your counterparts to become advocates of bold reform. If you are a part of the U.S. Treasury or any other Treasury or finance ministry, be that voice in that meeting when folks are saying, hey, what can we get done? Be the person who pushes that room to do more. If you are at one of those institutions, as Kevin is, be the guy who raises his hand and says, I will get 15 heads of state to Tanzania to make political commitments and make regulatory reforms around the energy sector so that IDA lending can move faster, so that African development lending can bring in more private capital, and so we can reach 300 million people who don't have connections. It's up to those of you in this room not just to celebrate the Prime Minister, but to actually take her call to action and act. And with that, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, we are thrilled and honored as always to have you with us.
Thank you. Distinguished guests all, that should be the example for us that when things fall down, we pick them back up and go again. And I start there because we have made progress. 3 years ago in this town, many of the things that we were saying would be anathema. And I think that it's sometimes important that we stop and recognize that we have had the power of agency to change, and to change things that were effectively guiding institutions for decades. And we've done it because what lies before us requires nothing less. The problem is that having started on the journey of change, can we guarantee success? And what is necessary to guarantee success? Do we need to double down more? Do we need to ensure that as we ask for more money, that we also demand more accountability in terms of the capacity to absorb that more money? Probably. Do we need to move with greater speed? Absolutely. The notion of 2 hurricanes hitting Florida in short space will be more immediately apparent to most than the 2.5 million people in Nigeria who have not been able to return to their homes. But both sets of circumstances are equally tragic. And the question is, have we developed, particularly with the level of war that there is in the world, and where there is no war, the level of crime, have we developed a tolerance for death and an acceptability that the price that should be paid for our slowness and our dilatory actions is the loss of lives? I ask us to reflect on this because Bridgetown is really not a single solution, nor is it about the arithmetic. It speaks in the context that will require others to do some maths, but it's fundamentally about the dignity attaching to each human being and our insistence that at all costs we need to keep ahead of the challenges. The finance is not the destination, but it is the oxygen. And the oxygen in the room, if it starts to get very scarce, it's going to suffocate all of us and not just a few. And I use that metaphor because there are still some who believe it's not yet at me. Well, it is at all of us. That's the truth. And part of the difficulty is that there's a complexity of governance that is going to be demanded at both the national and the international level. There is reform as a result of the reset, Amina, that we are agreeing to. But there also has to be nimbleness and adaptability on our part. When January 2020 came, even though we knew that there was a public health crisis emerging, none of us expected that it would take 3 years out of this decade. And certainly, Amina, those of you who were hopeful for greater progress, those of us who were hopeful for greater progress on the SDGs, had to swallow deeply and realize that people now simply had to focus on keeping lives and livelihoods going against this great threat. I say this because the adaptability that is needed from us is now to take the things that we have and prioritize them. And as we prioritize them, to recognize that human dignity and life is the only criteria, or the only inspiration, I should say, that we should have in making the decisions. And where does that leave us? One, as we say in the Bridgetown Initiative, we need to seriously increase the volume of money, not because we just want to call numbers, but if we're going to guarantee that by 2030, that people will be able to live without hunger. How are you going to do that? How are you going to change the food systems and the manner of production, particularly since many countries rely on open field agriculture, which is at the same time a victim of the floods and the droughts, the season of superlatives to which the Bridgetown Initiative speaks, that is now embracing us. With respect to energy, let's talk energy, but how are we going to talk energy until we can talk about who's going to take care of the other 300 million? We thank the World Bank and others for the mission of taking care of the 300 million without electricity in Africa, but who's going to take care of the other 300 million? 300 million is about the size of this country. So we're not talking about a minuscule population. And for the world to not recognize that Africa will be a source of global insecurity if you ignore Africa, even if you do not believe that it is the platform for global prosperity. And that is the harsh reality. And we have to disabuse ourselves that the mindset that could see Africa as a pawn to be distributed and carved up, or the Caribbean or other colonies that will just simply follow, is not the mindset that is going to guarantee success going forward, because whether we like it or not, all hands are needed on deck to be able to solve this problem. And that's why the Bridgetown Initiative speaks to changing the rules of the game, because even if we may not have power as small states, we have the capacity to undermine global stability, which is why the global public commons, which the Bridgetown Initiative also speaks to, is perhaps the most important long-term objective of this document. The global public commons. How many of you have been bitten by a mosquito? It's not a nice feeling. But to be bitten and not to get dengue or chikungunya or West Nile virus. A young girl, a teenager in my country, a few weeks ago died of the West Nile virus. West Nile virus is not supposed to be found in Barbados. It's not to be found in New York either, where people have also died. How did they get there? And we keep making decisions without believing that these consequences are not going to come, as you say, from far to near. So that the global public commons is the big strategic decision that is needed, while at the same time committing to prioritizing action for the next 5 years with respect to energy and electricity, to connectivity, to climate, to food, because without food and water, kiss it all goodbye. And indeed to education, because at the end of the day, when you have education, you have the ability to lift yourself out of poverty with dignity and to be able to add value to the human condition locally and nationally and probably internationally as well. Now, are these things impossible? No, they're not. The truth is that if we were to work in a cooperative manner and a coordinated manner, we would be able to ensure that we can get food to everybody on this earth by 2030, food and water. We can, at this point in time, say 300 million out of electricity as a consequence of us only having ambition for 300 instead of 600 is unacceptable. We can equally agree that with respect to the provision of education, it is time for big tech to come to the table and not only be speaking about the wonders and the risk of AI, but seeing how in practical terms we can produce a rugged tablet that is capable of providing education with content that they agree and help us to provide in a culturally sensitive way that can make a difference to those children who don't have access to school or teachers in their community because of the fact that they are just simply cut off from where they are. And we must at the same time recognize that without social protection and the ability to keep crime down, we don't have an investable gain. There's a lot to be done, but I genuinely believe that the big ticket decisions lie, some in this room, some at the institutions across the road, and we have the ability to start to unlock what is necessary. We have to shock-proof vulnerable economies. We work hard to come out of poverty. We're not here to go back into it. And if we don't have the cooperation that allows us to be able to stem the impact of the climate crisis, many countries will go back into poverty. And that will be a human tragedy. The bottom line is that the notion that historic per capita income is to be used for determining access can't work. And while we welcome the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which uses vulnerability as a determinant for access to longer-term capital at the IMF, we know, and while we welcome Ajay's introduction of the 50-year loan for those countries that have cross-border activity for climate, that is not enough, because it's not the cross-border activity or the lack of it that I can gauge by. If Beryl hits on land, as it did in Carriacou and in Union Island, you're destroying schools, you're destroying clinics. And at the end of the day, if we can't transition our schools and clinics to being resilient, what are we fighting for? The hurricane lasts for 2 days, a day. But the recovery effort with the absence of those schools and clinics will last for a decade if we don't have the investment to put it back in. So I appeal to you. Bridgetown is about 3 things. Fundamentally, changing the rules of the game, shock-proofing vulnerable economies, and being able to significantly augment the resources with an understanding that if we can put 300 billion towards the SDGs and 500 billion towards climate, we can begin to get there. But separate from the Bridgetown Initiative, we need a global methane agreement, because the evidence now is not only is it largely contributing to the worsening of the situation, but if we had the agreement and we were able to use and stop the emissions of methane, we can actually dial back the temperature by 0.5 degree. And that gives us the extra time and space. It doesn't solve the problem, but it gives us extra time and space to tackle the problem. So my message here to you this afternoon, and I regret that I can't stay to the end to hear you specifically, is that if this session could end, Raj, not just with us talking at each other, but having a discussion in this room and people being honest to give us the feedback. What is it that you believe, Alexia? What is it that you believe, all the rest of you in this room, that is going to help move the needle more? Because if you don't believe it and you don't help to carry the weight, then we're in trouble. The reason why I'm suggesting that by 2030 as well, we focus on eliminating hunger, providing electricity, providing education, and providing the social protection is because we need more people to carry the battle against the climate. And if we don't have those people come on board between now and 2030, the scale of the effort will simply not be there because it isn't about money alone. It is fundamentally about people. And if we can't have the behavioral change and the change in the mindset, starting among those in Washington, but extending across the entire globe, then we are going to literally be watching a sci-fi movie as things start to degenerate. I don't like sci-fi, never did, and I hope that there are others in this room who feel the same way as I do. And I ask you, please, I think the time for genuine feedback, honest, straight talk feedback in terms of action and timelines, because the timelines are at issue as well. You know how I feel about the levies for global public goods. I feel that the major intervention must be the restructuring and repurposing of the World Bank to be the guardian of the global public commons, and anything short of that is just literally, as Trinidadians would say, making as if we were doing something fundamental. We're not. And we're not equal to the task of this generation in the way that others were when they took the decisions that they took. I, however, do believe that we have it within us to rise to that point. But I need your feedback as to what you think will close the gap. Because at this stage, the time for our rhetoric, the time for speeches, the time for that kind of approach is over. What is needed now is consultative partnership. Where do we have common ground? Let us claim it and let us move again. Thank you.
Let's give our two leaders another hand. If you don't leave this room convinced that there's more that you can do, then we can get some paramedics in here and take your, because I think you've just heard both the rationale and the pathway to doing more. So thank you again, Prime Minister. Thank you again, Deputy Secretary General. Let's call up the first panel to talk about IDA and get to work.
Great. Thank you very much to the Rockefeller Foundation for hosting us here and bringing this extraordinary group of people together. My name is Adrian Lovitz. I work for One, which is a campaign organization dedicated to securing the necessary investments to ensure better economic opportunities and healthy lives, especially in Africa. And we see that as a challenge that is not about charity, but is about justice. My role is to lead our work in the UK and in the Middle East and in Asia Pacific, and I'm based in London. I'm going to introduce our terrific panel in a moment, but I was coming up towards M Street earlier and remembering that it was actually exactly 25 years ago when I, and some of you in the room may also have been there, was not inside the World Bank, but actually out on the street, shouting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, the World Bank has got to go." And we were talking then about 50 years is enough, remember that. What are we on now? Coming up for 80. Well, times have changed. Some of that challenge is still there, as we know. But, we were saying that back then because, I was Deputy Director of the Jubilee 2000 campaign back then. We were determined to get a result on that problem of unpayable debt of some of the most vulnerable countries in the world, the debts that were being serviced only at the expense of basic healthcare and primary education, and children especially having the chance of a better life, the life that we want for all of our children. Now, we made some important progress together, including, not least, through the World Bank, through the leadership of President Wolfensohn and others at that time. And together we did get commitments of around $100 billion of debt cancellation. But as the Deputy Secretary General said, we are here again with a new debt crisis, and so we have to go again. It's a slightly different profile, considerably different profile, the problem this time, as we know, so we need new approaches. But the point is that we've seen changes over those 25 years or so, changes in the role of the World Bank, and in the last sort of 25 months, I guess, we've seen further changes with the new leadership of President Banga. And this replenishment of the International Development Association, IDA 21, that is coming up is a really important test of the world's seriousness about its bank, about the World Bank. So few, I think, now would disagree. There would still be some saying, hey, hey, ho, ho. But few would disagree that the world could do with a bigger and, crucially, a better bank. That bank and the vision for that bank needs resources behind it. And the bank's shareholders, I guess, have two crucial roles to play in that. The first is a broader one, which is to ensure that there are enough resources, public as well as private, but when we're talking about governments, primarily public resources dedicated to development assistance. And it's terrific, and we'll come to the State Secretary in a moment, that we have a representative of a government here that is a 0.7% country. There are fewer of them than there were, far fewer than there ought to be, but Denmark is one shining example of that. And when the pie is bigger, of course, there's more that you can do with the slices. But a very important slice, and this is the second part of what we know the bank's shareholders are called on to do right now, is to ensure that this replenishment of IDA for IDA 21 is generous, ambitious, far-sighted, substantial, radical, pick your word, but we need the money. So it's an appropriate time, I think, to talk to this extraordinary group of leaders that are on the panel here today about how things are going. And we have Alexia Latortu, Assistant Secretary for the US Treasury, 20 years in international development, including with MCC, with IBRD, a number of roles in the US Treasury itself, and leading the US's efforts in engaging with this replenishment, as well as a lot of other stuff, which we'll come to. State Secretary Lotte Macon. Macon or Machon? As you like. I'll go Macron, who is State Secretary for Development Cooperation for Denmark. And of course, you've represented Denmark at the UN, but also in a number of African capitals, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, South Sudan, and at the African Union, and ECOWAS, I think. So bringing a terrific perspective to this conversation. And Vice President for Development Finance of the World Bank, Akihito Nishio. Aki, welcome. 30 years at the World Bank, so when I was outside shouting, you were inside saying, what is that noise? You shut the windows and got on with the work. Thank you for doing that. But you've led now, this is your third replenishment. You led IDA 19, you led IDA 20, both remarkable efforts with remarkable results. And now you're leading IDA 21, you're going for the hat trick.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So if I can start with you then, Aki, and you can take a mic. Tell us how it's going, because we were last together just a couple of weeks ago in London when you kindly came into the one office, and we hosted a group of civil society partners, and you updated everybody on how it was going. I think you've been in 3 countries in the 3 days before you came to us, and another 3 that you were off to in the following 3 days. So give us an update. How's it looking?
Right. Thank you. Let me first say that the kind of situation that IDA countries find themselves in at the moment, I find it to be unprecedented, in the sense that we have this overlapping crises, which consists of climate change, food insecurity, debt, conflict, all these things coming on top of each other. I've never seen anything like this in my 30 years at the bank. So the needs are quite significant and extraordinary. Now, against this, we have a situation with the donors. I think donors, 59 of them, in fact. I think they are very supportive, but they do have fiscal issues at home. The exchange rate hasn't moved in the right direction. So, and then there are some political shifts in donor countries. So we knew from the beginning that this is not going to be an easy replenishment. We knew that this is going to be a very challenging one. Now, having said that, now that we are less than 2 months from the final meeting in Seoul, December 5, 6, I'm seeing just a tremendous level of goodwill from donors and recipients alike. A very strong, push to lean forward, which I find very encouraging. And in particular, we see some very concrete signals being sent by some forward-leaning donors. And let me start with Denmark. Denmark's announcement of 40% increase over IDA 20 sent such a strong positive signal at UNGA. And I think I think that's really kind of set the tone for the remainder of the replenishment period. And I would like to say that there are countries which are now trying to follow suit. I'm unable to share the names here because I have a gag order. But I think you will be hearing at least one more country which will come up with a similar sort of increase, and perhaps another one the following week. So I sense this tailwind, as we head into the replenishment. We are hoping to get at least 105 billion, which would be the IDA 20 amount in real terms. But I think we have a chance to get there, and we will do everything we can together with you, with your strong support to get there.
And can you just help us understand, Aki, one problem which we know has come up for a number of governments, this challenge of foreign currencies and what's happened since the last replenishment, and how that target that you're going for a number of countries at least, is harder to reach than it would have been. Can you just unpack that for us so people understand?
Sure. Essentially, when we count the numbers in IDA, we do it in US dollars. Now, against the US dollar, most donor currencies have depreciated. Some of them by a very significant amount. The Japanese yen has fallen by 30%, 30, over the past year. And most donors, I think the only exception is the Swiss franc. Everything else has depreciated against the dollar. So that is very challenging. Now, as we go forward, we can to some extent try to mitigate the negative impact of foreign exchange movements by hedging, for instance. But there's a limit to what you can do, and also what really counts is how much we get at the time of the pledging. And there's a very, how should I say, a widely accepted way of calculating the exchange rate. So, that we cannot get away from, and we will have to deal with that. So that is definitely one of the complicating factors of IDA 21.
Okay, so complicated, but there are things that can be done to at least partially mitigate the challenge. That's great to hear. And finally, Aki, what if we fail here? What if we fall short? What does that mean in as human terms as it's possible to describe them, if you can, for the world's efforts?
Right. So, this morning, Ajay had an event with many donors and recipients, and both Alexia and Lotte were there. Ajay made a very strong point that electricity is really a must if we want to talk about jobs. And he even said this is a human right. Now, one of the things that we're trying to do under IDA 21 is to provide 300 million in Africa with access to electricity. But if we don't get 205 billion, I think there's going to be a significant shortfall in that. And we may be able to finance only maybe half, or at best 3/4 of what we want during the IDA 21 period. And then there are also implications if we don't get the desired amount on things like debt. Because what happened? Because IDA has been providing a steady flow of concessional financing to countries that are highly indebted, those that have high risk of debt distress. So those countries will have less less net positive flows. And that would mean they will have to go to less concessional lenders, even non-concessional ones, commercial ones. And that's going to add to their debt very much. And the last thing I will say is, fragility is a major issue in the IDA space. Over the last 10 years, lending, financing to fragile states has increased from 14% of the envelope to 40% of the envelope. So that's a very large scale up. But if we don't get the amount that we need, then we're not going to be able to help these fragile states as much as we could. And just remind ourselves that by 2030, 60% of the world's extreme poor will be in these fragile states. So we're just going to lose more and more ground in this fight against fragility.
Thank you, Aki. Lotte, as Aki said, a $491 million commitment from Denmark that came early, which was terrific, and is a 40% increase from the last time round. Tell us a bit more, if you can give us an insight into how these things work. What was the process that led to that decision, and why did you land where you did?
Thank you so much, and it's indeed a very big pleasure to be here today in such an extremely knowledgeable audience. And I think for us, I mean, it was a pretty clear choice. It was what our partners in the South were asking. There was the meeting in April with the African heads of state, came out very strongly with a political call for all of us to step up. Then we had the negotiations on the Pact for the Future, and it became an ask during the negotiations that we should make a robust replenishment. And we were in no doubt that we had to step up and do it. Because sort of being a little bit more lofty, I mean, as we've heard, the holy crisis that the world is facing, and the IDA countries are facing crisis on an unprecedented scale. If we are to be able to work together, we need to have trust. And trust is based on us delivering, each of us, on our promises. And here we needed to heed the call. So that was clear to us that we need to do that. And then simply we agreed with partners, and as just laid out, I mean, this is a good investment. There is a gearing factor of a 3 to 4 with the dollar or the kroner that we put in. And that's what we need to raise and go from billions to trillions, as we have heard so many times. And then I think Denmark, as a 0.7 country, we aren't many in that club. We feel pretty lonely. I invite others in. There is a certain membership tax that you need to, and it's 0.7, but it's a good club. So, but we can do it, and not everyone is in the political situation where they can do it, and less is also okay. I think each of us needs to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say, did we do what we could do to actually step up or be that person, as Raja said earlier. And we wanted to be that person.
And how do you hope that your decision, and many thanks to those who have to leave us.
No disrespect, but I have a 1 p.m. flight.
No,
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you so much for your words.
How do you feel that how do you hope your decision will impact on others, if we're thinking about the next 2 or 3 weeks and beyond that, I guess, next couple of months? Is that a conscious part of the calculation for Denmark to have made that statement when you did, in order to hope to see a sort of cascade coming?
Yes, I mean, obviously yes. There was a reason why we did it at the UNGA. It was to put mild pressure on our like-minded countries to actually step up, as I said. But again, and I just said that, I mean, not everyone is in a political situation as a bilateral donors as we are, that to able to actually do a 40% increase, and we hope others will follow at that scale, but less can do it. I think it's important that we try to do our utmost, each of us, to step up and deliver on the promises so we can work together to actually try to solve some of the crises that we are faced with today.
Thank you. And I will take your cue of reference to the 0.7 club, and my own country, the UK, of course, has a new government. I don't think we have any UK government representatives in the room, but they're certainly here this week, and we are somewhat fearful, to be honest, about the UK government's budget coming through next week, but still hopeful, because if we don't have hope, what do we have? That we can avoid the worst outcome in this new government's budget next week. and then see an ambitious and much more positive pathway over the coming years. So I just want to get that plug on the record. Alexis, you've been this morning with African finance ministers, and I know you talk a lot, as other panel members do, with finance ministers from around the world. And I guess part of the message there was this is not just about a bigger bank, but a better bank, right? How do you see that challenge?
Thank you so much. I think that's really important. We heard the destination matters. We need oxygen to get to the destination, but I want to start indeed there because, IDA, through its 60 years now, has such a strong track record of delivery. And for the United States, that's the motivator, right? We know that IDA is so powerful that it's actually had 36 countries graduate from IDA, and some of them have become donors to IDA. And if there's no better, I think, demonstration of the effectiveness of this largest source of concessional finance that exists on our world. And we know how important concessional finance is today to deal with all the challenges that Aki described so well. And so, IDA being effective in helping countries deal with the ravages of these global challenges that are, frankly, unraveling development progress that's been achieved, whether it's, the climate change challenges that we heard Amina speak about so powerfully, but also fragility really affecting so many countries or parts of countries in big ways, but pandemics as well. And, we've been looking at MPOX, and so it knows how to deal with that. But I think really importantly, the message we also heard from many of the finance ministers who are recipient countries from IDA is we look at IDA not only to manage our risks, but to help really turbocharge the opportunities for our countries. And that's about the 1.5 million and growing new entrants monthly into the job market in sub-Saharan Africa. And what will we have for them? Will we have decent, good jobs? Will they be able to benefit from the new jobs of the green economy? That's the kind of thing that IDA helps on. It's, and Amina touched on this as well, it's the digital transformation and technology, if used responsibly, how that can actually be a force for inclusion, how it can reduce costs, make things more efficient. So that's what IDA does, and the United States is really proud to be the largest historical donor to IDA, as well as the largest donor to IDA 20, for those reasons. And let's see what we do for IDA 21.
You could say now if you want.
Oh, I would make your life too easy as a moderator.
Just saying the opportunity's there. And the debt challenge that the DSG mentioned earlier, can you just help us sort of think through and understand how that compounds the challenge that IDA 21 needs to help to address?
I mean, that's a critical question. Half of IDA countries are either at risk or already in high debt distress. There is no single low-income country that is at low risk of debt distress. Okay, so that's the challenge. And IDA has been a really strong provider of net positive flows, and that needs to remain the case. And there, I think it requires really smart work across all of us in terms of how we shape the financial package of IDA, because it would be a shame to have a bigger IDA, but not a better IDA. And what I mean by that is if we harden the terms of the financing of IDA in order to have a bigger IDA, maybe today we're happy, but tomorrow those countries will not be happy. And so we need to be really smart about the overall level of concessionality in the largest multilateral source of concessional finance.
Very clear. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I'm looking for Eric, and I can't see him, so we're on our own here. So let's have a go. I think we need to catch up a little bit. I think we've got a few minutes. So let's take the Prime Minister's encouragement to have some straight talk and discussion, and hear some thoughts from others here present. Who would like to ask a question of our panel here? Can I see a hand or two? Raj, start us off. That would be great. There's a mic. Thank you.
I'd love to hear, especially from the perspective of the shareholders. Aside from the IDA replenishment, what do you have feedback to the point that Mia made about the overall vision that's been laid out in Bridgetown? Like, are there other sources of longer-term concessional capital? Is there potential to do more with SDRs and the RST? Do you have any critical feedback of what we've been advocating for across those various institutional reform elements, including having the bank play a much bigger role on public goods, global public goods, potentially redefining itself in that context?
Maybe I'll jump in. So, I mean, yes, I actually have a table, maybe even in my bag next to Alok, that literally looks at every, and we've done this for Bridgetown 1.0, 2.0, and now 3.0. We look at every single word in the documents, and we have a table of what do we think about this? Do we agree? And if so, what can we do tomorrow? Do we agree with the spirit, but the path is different, or do we disagree for some reason? So we literally take Bridgetown very seriously. And since, very much in the spirit of Bridgetown, since 2022, when Secretary Yellen launched the call for evolving those institutions so that we're not, hey-ho, getting rid of them, but we're evolving them, the mandate there was to challenge ourselves, as well as challenge the management of the banks, and expand our conventional wisdom. And I think that's what we've done for ourselves, and Bridgetown has accelerated and informed our own process in that way. And so, the Prime Minister talked about three main goals, right? So increasing climate finance. So we said, development banks, and ourselves, we need to think about these balance sheets in different ways. With all the track record of these institutions, can they take more risk on their balance sheets? Can they use their balance sheets more effectively? And we convinced ourselves, yes, and said, go for it. And, and we've seen that the G20 estimates that about 360 billion additional lending headroom over the next 10 years from the institutions, are going. So that's just one example. Prime Minister also talked about shock-proofing the institutions. And so we really looked at the climate agenda, although that's not the only area of shock, in very careful ways. And we talked about the climate resilient debt clauses that St. Vincent and Grenadines was able to evoke so that they delayed payments when Hurricane Berthel hit. So that's, another example. And then the other piece was about changing the rules or evolving the rules. So for example, in IDA, since we're talking about IDA, there were countries like Haiti, Somalia, that, the rules would have said, you're no longer a grant-only country. And we said, well, who makes the rules? I think we do. And, so we changed so that Haiti and Somalia will still have access to grant funding. These are just three tiny examples. There's so many more. But I think, let's stop the speeches and let's get to the granularity and the challenges of the technical work combined with political ambition is changing things.
Lotte?
No, I can be very brief and just say that obviously we are taking Bridgetown extremely seriously, and I think it's actually made some tectonic shifts that we are now moving forward, and we couldn't have thought about the bigger, better, and bolder or more efficient banks and the whole evolution agenda if we haven't had also the Bridgetown agenda. And I think for us it's been about sort of trying to hammer in the point that all of us donors, development partners, need to think long-term instead of having short-term national interests and put them ahead of what we're doing. And for us, it's been sort of we're both working on the IBRD, the guarantees, and there is the hybrid capitals, but then and that's for the middle-income countries, and then we have the IDA for the low-income. So I think in that sense we are working on all tables, so to speak. That was a short answer. I could give a longer one, but I know time is up.
Thank you, Lotte. Thank you. Okay, we have got a couple now. I think we'll have to be just actually. Thank you. Yes, we're getting the mic. So, lady in the green jacket there. Thank you, and then we'll go over to the left.
Great. I did notice that I added color to the room. I'm Katrin. I'm with the Open Contracting Partnership, which is actually an initiative that started at the WBI when Aki was there. So it's good to see you again. So one thing talking about challenges that I wanted to ask about, which is something we heard a lot about in New York a few weeks ago, and it's also an ask from the One campaign, is about local accountability and being able to trace the money that governments give. So let's say, right, Denmark contributes money, but then you want to see what happens in Barbados, right? Which road is being built and how can the community give feedback that they're receiving the money. So that is something that we at the partnership pay attention to, because there are very few countries, right, that connect aid to budget to contracts to local feedback loops and being able to follow all of that flow of information and that interactions with government. So I was wondering how your different institutions are working on that important loop.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Let's take two more questions. I'm going to take the gentleman down here. If we could come down to the front first, please, and then I'll go back. May not be able to get everybody. Amadou, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Amadou Hott, former Minister of Economy of Senegal and former senior member of the African Development Bank team. My question is actually about the issue of a better bank. A bigger bank is fantastic, but coupling it with a better bank is extremely important. And on the receiving side also, better receiving so that we can implement faster. Because often projects are approved across the global MDB system, whether it's in Asia or AFDB or IDA or whatever, the disbursement rates are relatively low. And if disbursement is low, then impact is not there. Even if you sign the loan, you've done everything. What can IDA or ADF, going also into replenishment, do to support the governments with the skills, the competence, the methodology, so that everything can go much faster? You see something approved 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you're still at 10% disbursement rate. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question, Amadou. I'm going to the gentleman there. Yes. Thank you. And I think that may be all we have time for because there's another great panel on its way.
Good morning. Khalil Wadigi from Think Equal. I have a question for the State Secretary from Denmark. Denmark will have the presidency of the European Union in a year, so during the FFD summit, during probably the G20, COP30. What do you think, what do you see, you're probably already thinking about projecting to that period, what do you see as opportunities to progress, for the EU to progress this overall agenda, development, climate, what we've been talking about this morning? Do you see opportunities a year from now?
Thank you, Khalil. Let's start there, if we could then. Lotte, would you like to come in on that one first of all? Then I'll bring Aki and Alexia in.
Oh, thank you very much. So we take over the EU presidency just after the FFD in Madrid. So we'll be looking to other colleagues for that, but the Polish colleagues. But no, certainly there will be internally. Can I say a sort of internal budget processes in the EU that will be an opportunity, that will be the new budget cycle that we will start negotiation on, and it's clear to Denmark that we have with our development profile clear priorities in that regard, both when it comes to sort of our near neighborhood but also globally, and we will press for that, so having a strong external budget. There will be opportunities, as you say, both during the UNGA and the COP30 with the NDCs, where everyone will deliver. And here, for us, a priority will be, and maybe I'll just leave it at that, to try to merge the development, the SDG tracks and the climate tracks. So we still see too many silos. We need to sort of merge them, so to speak, and just realize, and I think it was laid out clearly earlier this morning, that you cannot separate development and climate. And when we finance one, it should also sort of help the other. And honestly, when we look especially at the climate funds, there are too many funds sitting there not being used because of inefficiency or the over-bureaucratic models. And there was also a question about IDA, and I think the simplification, that's really also an ask for us, sort of when we did our 40% sort of increase, it also comes with some requests in the negotiations about simplifications of procedures and bringing down the project cycles and in fact move from project and programs to a more systemic approach. That's where we will have the lasting results.
Thank you, Lotte. Aki, what are your thoughts on those questions? And you hear this this call for pace in disbursements very regularly, I'm sure, don't you? And also to Catherine's question too.
Yes. So let me perhaps start with the pace. So we are trying very hard to accelerate the pace of implementation, and under the leadership of Anna Bierde, we have started on that whole program. Now, what I find interesting is that the disbursement ratio does not, how should I say, it's not very straightforward how you can anticipate the country's disbursement ratio. I learned recently that disbursement ratio for Somalia is 37%, one of the highest in the bank. And I think it's partly a function of how well designed the projects are, how simple the projects are, and also how strategically do you position the human resources. So I think there are different ways to accelerate the pace of implementation. Now, for the World Bank clientele as a whole, we have started on what we call the academy, and this is really to build the capacity of client countries. Well, Catherine might remember that there used to be a institution called the World Bank Institute, which did just that. So it's sort of like going back a little bit to that model. But we are, quite determined to help countries in building capacity. Just one word on the question that Catherine raised about tracking of resources. We do that very meticulously with financial management specialists on the ground, but we can't sort of like, trace which country's money went to which country. That we cannot do. But the flip side of that is that we are able to track how money provided by donors can broadly benefit the whole portfolio of operations in different sectors. What I mean by this is you might have a donor country which is interested in having either do more on education. Now, but if you have that interest, you can quite visibly see how much IDA financing goes to education. And you can see, very easily through the corporate scorecard, through other means, which countries, which sectors are benefiting from these projects. You can also break it down by beneficiaries, male, female, etc. So we do have mechanisms to track such flow of funds.
Thank you, Aki. Alexia, your final thoughts.
I like all the questions and the answers because I think we're starting to talk about the effectiveness of financial flows. And my view is that there's far little to discussion around that. And even to your point, Lotte, about the climate finance funds that exist, I mean, how to make it easier for countries to actually access with speed the existing sources of finance. There is such room for progress just on that. Like even what financing is there, actually countries have a hard time getting to it. So I think, Amadou, your question is spot on, and I think the work on agility and speed that Anna is leading, that has cut down already by 3 months the time for project design is good, and I know there's ambition to do a lot more. I think the other thing is just diagnosing the issue, right? So there are lots of assumptions about why things are slow. Sometimes people think things are slow because of safeguards. I think the reality is much more complex, including, and I think, Amadou, that was implicit in your question, challenges at the country level. So we have, for example, and I don't want to pick on a region, but maybe I'll share an example of in Central America. We have projects that have been approved at some development banks that are just not moving. Sometimes they require parliamentary action, and it just doesn't happen. And so how can that also be part of the work of the institutions, the banks, to support the countries for the follow-through for the funds to, actually truly be used? And then, in terms of, I really care deeply about impact and outcome, and I care a lot about measurement, but we can also get ourselves into knots, on that, including, by the way, having an incentive for the most simple things as opposed to the more complex things, especially in a world where fragility and food security and climate are all intertwined. And if we want to chase each of the climate dollars and the food security dollars, you can actually end up really creating disincentives. And so, I think you need to understand the logic of the design of programs, and I say programs and not projects on purpose, because I think we need more sort of sectorial approaches, cluster approaches, looking at infrastructure systems, not just one asset. And then it's not about attribution, it's about contribution. And in our system, we have had, strangely, very strong advocates from the part of the government that's the defense. Because we have generals who have said, we talked about the Pact of the Summit and, peace and prosperity and peace, who know full well in a palpable way that if things and development works well in a country, that is effective, it's cheaper than the alternative.
Perfect point to end on. My huge thanks to our panel, Alexia Latotu, Lotte Machon, and Aki Nishio, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking this panel.
I'd like to invite the next panelist to come on up. Like to invite the next panelist to come on up. You don't want to lose people. We have some excellent speakers that it's going to be very difficult to top all of them, but I'd like to, but I'm up for the challenge. We all are. So I'd like to invite Joseph Nganga to come on up, Leslie Maustorp, Kevin Karyuki, Rachel as well, Moreya Shodi. I'm going to sit down in just a minute. In fact, Rachel was just commenting about how many notes that I took, and I'm not a big note taker. There are a million, for those of you who know that I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, there's a lot of material here from those last two speeches, or the last two panels. We wanted to bring this down to a real grassroots level, although the people that we've heard from already really focused on bringing it down to a grassroots level in terms of what needs to be done to advance the Bridgetown Initiative, the reform of the MDB system, and global financial architecture. And I just wanted to start a little bit by setting the tone. I'm Andy Herskowitz. I'll introduce myself first for those of you who don't know me. Recently joined Rockefeller Catalytic Capital, where we're working on the Mission 300 Accelerator. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Mission 300, it's the World Bank and African Development Bank-led initiative with support from Rockefeller Foundation, Sustainable Energy for All, and the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet to meet this commitment to helping 300 million Africans get access to electricity by 2030, which is an extremely bold ambition, but it's something that we know that we can achieve. And so we're working to try to bring all these partners together to bring in support from the entire ecosystem, not just the World Bank and African Development Bank financing, but seeing what we need to do to build capacity, seeing what support we need to bring to private sector, how we can engage civil society in this as well to make sure that everybody's bought into this, and most importantly, making sure that business is part of this. So there were some pretty powerful quotes that were given. I'm going to read back a few of them, but we're going to then go straight to the panel. I just want to start by saying that there isn't going to be an energy transition without energy access. And we heard about that. You heard about the number of people who are in poverty. Yesterday, someone made a statement that 10 times as much power is generated from diesel generators in Nigeria. That's a bigger number than I heard before, than is generated from the grid. So as we look at Africa becoming the most populous continent, with the most rapid economic growth trajectory, the largest population growth, if we don't solve this issue, the climate crisis is a climate disaster, and it's only going to get worse and worse, so we need to address this. The financing terms haven't been working. We heard from Mia Motley, who talked about financing is not the destination, but it's the oxygen, and if there's not enough oxygen, then we all start to suffocate. And the global financial architecture has been broken, and I was happy to hear from Amadou as well, because we talk a lot about the IDA replenishment, and that goes to the bigger when we talk about bigger, better, and bolder in terms of the changes that need to be made to the global financial architecture. But it's really the shareholders of the institutions themselves, both the multilateral development banks and the development finance institutions, that need to help deliver on the better and bolder. It's one thing to ask the bilateral donors to give more money, but it's something else to get them to say in the boardrooms of these institutions that it's okay to not earn back 100 cents on the dollar, and it's going to be okay, and we're going to get you some ODA if you're a bilateral DFI to help you do deeper blending to actually deliver on what's needed. Going back to LinkedIn again, one of the reasons I'm active is I think it's so important to hear from people from throughout the world and their perspectives. And I was just looking at something that I posted yesterday, and someone said, the energy crisis in Nigeria and most African countries could be significantly addressed with the widespread provision of single-digit financing, a single-digit financing facility for the acquisition of small home and commercial solar systems and mini-grids. It's that easy. It's low-cost financing. And unfortunately, the financing that we see from many institutions, because they're not doing direct financing to people, ends up being double-digit financing, whether it's for solar home systems or if it's going to be for large-scale energy projects. And that just doesn't work. And this is what we need to fix. So that's the intro. And very rarely do you get to handpick your panel, but I got to do that because there are people I know who are willing to really buck the system and bring creative solutions and speak truth to power. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and this is going to be a little bit free-flowing, but I'm going to go ahead and start with Kevin Koriyuki, Vice President at the African Development Bank, who's part of the joint working group for Mission 300. Tell us a little bit about Mission 300, his perspectives, and what do you think needs to be done differently, and what are we doing differently with Mission 300?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think the first thing I would want to disabuse is the notion that maybe we never worked with the World Bank before. We did, but it was more on a project by project basis and on an ad hoc basis. And looking at where we are, we just heard from Mia Motley this morning that we need to step up the change. There has to be a step up, a change in what we're trying to do. And so we realized, I think our two principals realized, and I think it was in the first meeting, actually before, after President Banga was nominated to be the candidate for presidency, he came and they were sitting in Abidjan, and they said, what is the one thing that we can be able to do to make a significant and transformational difference? And it came to energy. And so they said, okay, so if that's the case, then let's try and come up with something that is truly, truly transformational. And so in the course of discussions before the meetings in April, there were discussions. And World Bank came up with a number, and they asked us, would you like to join us on this journey? And of course, we said, yes, we would like to join you on the journey. And but the bottom line is that there is a realization that it cannot be business as usual. There has to be radically different things. And so we said, okay, yes, our two principals have spoken. We have to to provide new access to 300 million people by 2030. But what exactly does that mean? And so what it turned out to be is that I like using, I'm an engineer, so I like quoting from, using terms that are technical. So I said, I'll consider this as an equation. There's the one side of the equation, and that side of the equation is what the MDBs are going to do. That is the African Development Bank and the World Bank and other partners, of course, with the catalytic help of GAP, C4All, and Rockefeller Foundation. So we will be able to mobilize the resources at whatever scale and at the required speed. But on the other hand, it is important that there be ability to receive those resources, to be able to convert those opportunities into projects and projects into access. And what that requires is that on the left side of the equation, the one side of the equation, is that then there must be reforms. And that's why we've come up with 5 pillars that are supposed to ensure this happens in terms of the level of reforms that are required. First of all, there has to be affordable generation capacity. Number 2, we have to find ways of interconnecting grids so that we address the issue of the sizes of the projects that we have, because if projects are always small, I always quote a country like Chad, where you have maybe 200 megawatts as the total installed capacity. The projects that you can do in those countries are fairly small. So to be able to make them bigger, you need to be able to interlink the grids. So the issue of interconnecting grids, harmonizing regulatory frameworks that ensure that happens becomes very important. But we also know that to be able to provide electricity access in a continent where you have very interspersed populations, it is important that you find ways of going beyond the grid. And hence, the notion that we all know that at least 50% of new connections by 2030 have to be from distributed renewable energies. And therefore, that becomes another important pillar for us, because what we are saying is that we want to provide electricity access within the grid and beyond the grid. So there must be policies that will be able to facilitate that. And finally, then we also say, okay, you may want to do all these things, but this must be underpinned by utilities that are sustainable. Because without sustainable utilities, then you have the problem, because you don't generate insufficient resources that are going to be able to ensure that the generation, transmission, distribution, and supply is actually efficient. So I think those principles now espouse what we call that. Once you combine those reforms that I've spoken about with the resources, we'll now try and memorialize those in the form of energy compacts. And these energy compacts will be actually signed on by the country's heads of state. The idea here is that there must be political goodwill to be able to ensure this works. Because it's one thing to say that you want to have electricity access by 2030, sort of so many connections by 2030, but you must prioritize provision of electricity in your development process. Because what we find, and this is what I found very surprising, is that when we countries about this time of the year indicate their priorities, they will always, and depending on their election cycles, if it's an election year, you'll find that they'll probably prefer road projects, water projects, and not power projects. And therefore, you can't have your cake and eat it. So it is important that if you really want to make a difference on electrification, you must allocate resources. And it is then, as the World Bank and AFDB, with the help of what we call the supporting cast, then what it means then that we will be able now to translate or to co-design the projects that will eventually lead to actual projects that will result in providing electricity access. Let me stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out a couple other stats, though, because this is important. And I've said somewhat casually that this isn't complicated. It's essentially a construction project and a sales project. And every other region in the world has done electrification. And you've got a construction project. You essentially need money, you need a plan, and you need the people to be able to do it. And which is the political will, but also the right people implementing it. And so you can extend the grid anywhere, right? It's a construction project, and we can have a lot of these discussions, conferences, et cetera. And are we going to be able to pull this off? But one thing that makes this construction and sales project different is that they estimate that half the people will need to get electricity from distributed sources, whether it's mini grids or solar home systems. Of those half people, about almost 80% of them don't actually have the ability to pay for electricity at this point, which requires a tremendous amount of subsidy and creative solutions. If you're really going to do this, it requires money. I'm going to turn to Joseph Nganga from the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet to share his perspectives on how do we make sure this construction and sales project actually happens.
Thanks, Andy. And I see you've taken liberties, not just in appointing the panel, but also changing the questions.
I warned you all that I chose the panel, and I also told you all I had to, give my concept notes. So these are the questions. I said, but I'm not going to stick to them, so we're okay.
Yeah. So I think the key answer here, and Kevin really framed it really well. So I'm only going to add a couple of points. I think the important point, one of the two important points I'm going to make is that the supporting cast is part of the answer. And the supporting cast is not just SE for All, GIAP,
I wouldn't
and
call us
Rockefeller.
supporting. You think we're not supporting cast?
I'm referencing Kevin's
right?
terminology. How would you like me to call
We're
that?
just cast
Okay.
members.
The cast
We're all in
members
this together.
are critically important because, again, if you think about electrification, it's not just about delivering the electrons. Do those electrons then go towards generating income so the utilities are sustainable? Are they addressing health, education? I was really excited to hear from DSG Amina Mohammed about AI. Today, with Khan Academy, a tablet, AI, you can give a young person in rural DRC the same quality of education as they would get anywhere in the West. Why? Because technology today is allowing us to deliver that. But what is a critical enabler? Anybody know? Power, electricity, exactly. So for this to work, we have to frame it not as an electricity construction project, but a whole economy construction project, which then allows governments to allocate a bigger portion of their IDA and AFD to electricity to unlock this other development agenda. The second piece, I think, and there are many, many more. As I speak, I'm thinking of more, but I'm going to stick to two. The second is ownership. The ownership needs to sit with African governments. It needs to sit with African investors, because after this first 300 million, there's still another 380 million if you ask us. I think the World Bank thinks it's 580 million, whatever. The point is there are hundreds more million that need to be electrified. And to get there, if we have ownership by African governments and they drive the fast round, we have ownership with African investors and businesses, and they deliver on the fast round, we will have left the capacity, the experience, the knowledge to get the next 300. And I believe that's a critical part of this being successful as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I want to bring in the private sector perspective from Rachel, who's the CEO of ARM Harris, which has investment funds and is raising investment funds focused on energy infrastructure in West Africa, but in particular has experience in working in distributed renewable energy space. Just to hear your perspectives from the outside, what do you see as the incentives that are needed to encourage the DFIs and the MDBs to make the necessary investments? And I stuck to the question, so.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, you did. Thanks again for having me. I just want to bring into perspective my career, not for the sake of talking about my journey, but to illustrate what I see in the market in terms of the challenges that we face in bringing additional infrastructure in our markets. So I started my career as a developer, and they were going, it was a company that was going into places where nobody wanted to go to, and we were building power infrastructure across various technologies. And then they left Africa. Then I moved to a DFI, right? Because they were doing deals that no one wanted to do. The commercial banks couldn't, and they took risks that were much needed in order to bring some critical projects on stream. And then they stopped. Then I moved to commercial banks because that particular commercial banks was doing projects that my DFIs was not doing anymore. And I felt that there was something they were seeing that we couldn't see from where we were standing. I went ahead and did some projects there. And then realized as well that there's a limit also that comes with that setup. Today, I'm in a private equity fund because it's very entrepreneurial, because we have high risk appetite, but we also have expertise to manage those risks. The one thing that we don't have is capital. And so we are able to be nimble enough to go into places to bring projects to bankability, to create a certain type of market for deals and transactions to be able to be done. But when we talk about the DRE space, for example, where we do have users that are not able to pay for those connections, we fundamentally getting into what the crux of the issue is, which is the pressure on returns. And I think I mentioned that journey because once those companies stopped, it was because of the pressure on returns in every single one of those. And with that comes a certain risk appetite that becomes limited, or at least forces the organization to shift into lower risk or higher top returns project. So for the DRE, what we're facing, and thanks to the institutions that are here on the panel, actually every single institution on this panel, we've benefited from their support, either in terms of grants or concessional funding, to be able to bring connections in areas that are not today connected to the grid. Without that blended type of financing, we will not be able to reach that population. But even in doing so, again, we are requested or required as fiduciary duty to also bring returns to our investors, right? And so there is really a fundamental critical issue, which is being able to balance, and it's a very difficult balance, between the returns and the impact. The DFI's community are weighing both, even though we see often now that shifting a bit more to be more commercial, than it used to be, if I could say that, which begs the question in terms of the mission of the institutions and the weight that they put in their staff in terms of delivering those returns and being able to have that impact. It's not going to be easy. All the projects are not all commercially driven, right? And when we talk about climate justice, we need to be able to speak about the ones that are not today reachable, and for a good reason. If the grid didn't go there because it didn't make financial sense. So the question is, who's going to help us bear that responsibility, and how do we manage that to make sure that we do not leave anyone behind?
Okay. So the next panelist, the weight of the world rests on your shoulders, and I'm going to tell you why. So I'm so excited to introduce Leslie Mastorp, who is the CEO designate of British International Investment. But what's important about Leslie, not only is he a South African, which is unprecedented to have the head of the British DFI come from another country, particularly one from the Global South, but Leslie also has years of experience working with the AAIB, understanding...
New Development Bank.
New Development Bank. Okay, sorry, New Development Bank, yeah. Confusion there for the New Development Bank. So he understands the perspective, a global perspective from others about the type of business that needs to be done differently as well. So with that, I want to just talk to Leslie. I mean, you have a tremendous opportunity. We heard from Prime Minister Motley and Amina Mohammed, and I think one of them said that human dignity, was Mia Motley, said, human dignity in life is the only inspiration that should drive our decisions. They're basically saying the decision shouldn't be driven by returns. And that's extremely powerful. It's something that a lot of us think that that's the role of the public institutions, the public financing institutions, to really change their way of doing business. Can you share some of your thoughts and the direction where you'd like to see BII go as you assume this new role, and what you've seen work? And I will give BII credit, because BII did launch the African Resilience Investment Accelerator a few years ago with other DFIs, with the idea to really doubling down on trying to figure out how to make more investments in fragile countries. So over to you, Leslie, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thanks for having me and for the leadership that Rockefeller Foundation and specifically Mission 300 is playing in this regard. It is, as you said, it's a deep honor for me to, all of 3 days now, having been in this role, to lead the British International Investment. The perspectives I want to share is naturally not from a BII perspective, because I'm still, needing to settle into the office, get my feet under the desk, to sort of understand the machinery of this great institution with a 76-year history, working across 1,500 companies in 65 countries in the world, balance sheet just over $10 billion, and one of the oldest impact investors. A couple of points I'd like to make. I mean, I think that the target of 300 million is really very, very critical, because when you have a target, it really focuses the mind. There's a very clear. We now can hold big institutions like the African Development Bank, World Bank, and all of us here to account, to put plans in place to make sure that we achieve that target. I mean, having spent the last 9 years in sort of development finance in a multilateral bank, it became very clear to me that we have to develop new approaches. We have to find new ways of delivering on our business models, because in order to achieve the kind of scale we desire, we cannot do that with our existing architecture. I've just come from a meeting now of the CEOs of all the development finance institutions, where the real discussion is about how can we lower transaction costs. As we, for example, look at the energy access challenge in Africa, what could we do differently? How can we, for example, harmonize our standards, our ESG standards, our procurement design, our due diligence processes, so that when Proparco, DEG, IFU, BII, when we work alongside GIAP, when we work alongside other sources of philanthropic capital, work with the World Bank, the IFC, and so on, it becomes simpler and more streamlined in order for us to work together. So the first point I therefore want to make is that there's a lot of innovation happening right now to just make the entire system function better. And this is something that Ajay Banga has emphasized over the last year and 3 months of his term in office. The second point I'd like to make is that the deepening this collaboration will require some fresh and new approaches. One of the real advantages of BII is that it has developed now this deep track record in working in frontier markets, some of the most difficult jurisdictions, and in fact, in taking equity positions, the riskiest portion of the capital stack. So we therefore can play a role to crowd in, a role as a sort of catalyst to bring in many more institutions, and we therefore will work towards portfolio approaches, moving away from the project-by-project approach that has defined development finance in the past. The third point I'd like to make, Andy, is around the more contentious issues that we have to discuss now. Naturally, I work now for a British institution that has its own policy positions, but I do think that the issue of fossil fuels, specifically gas on the continent, has to be discussed as a major potential obstacle over the next 6-7 years as we want to achieve the Mission 300 objectives. I say that because Africa is richly endowed with gas resources, and gas is an intermediate important sort of source of power, gas to power, to fill the gap, if you like, and to provide sort of stability to the energy systems. Renewable energy on its own will not get us there. So therefore, developing a more nuanced approach to gas as the sort of least polluting of the fossil fuels, if you like, is very important for the G7 economies to arrive at some common position on. Maybe just sort of the final point that I would like to make is around the need for fresh approaches around sort of the financial engineering part. We've heard a lot about blended finance, but now I think, especially with the IFC and the EBRD, who have been leaders in this space, we need to now scale the numbers on blended finance, and it's all captured in the convergence reports every year. It's still minuscule, right? So there's still a significant need to just up the ante, to put a lot more pressure on those structurers to look at how we can use the tools of finance to come up with the kind of deals that will be transformative on the continent. Thank you.
No, that was great. And I'm going to throw you a lifeline on the gas statement, because I've said many similar things going into COP. But I think the argument is, and this is the argument that I made with the foundations, is Africa could have an energy ecosystem without gas. But to do that, there needs to be serious investment in cross-border transmission infrastructure, which is not inexpensive. And you could take advantage of the hydro resources in Zimbabwe and Zambia and other countries, and the geothermal in East Africa that provide baseload energy. But until the public sector entities and the philanthropies are willing to go big on building out that transmission infrastructure, gas is going to be there. So if they really want to double down and have the energy transition, they need to pony up the resources and invest in the transmission infrastructure. And it's a hard pill for a lot of the climate entities to swallow, but it's one that they need to swallow. Otherwise, we're going to be having the same conversation 20, 30, 40 years from now. So we obviously got pushed back because other things running late. So I'm just going to see if we have a question or two from anyone here, because we're going to have to wrap up. I want to keep our panelists on schedule for the day as well. Are there any questions? Yeah, Amadou, please.
Thank you. Just a quick question on the financial engineering. Having been in Kevin's shoes before going into government before, one of the big issues that we have in the electricity with PPAs, everybody talks about cost-reflective tariffs. If you don't have that, it's not bankable. But if you reflect all the cost, the user cannot afford it as well. Should we say reasonable cost-reflected tariff? Because the cost of financing or the tenors have not been really reasonable. Because you do a power plant, hydro, the loan is 17 years or 15 years maybe max. That will affect definitely the PPA. But if you could do like a 30-year loan, maybe with a bullet point at the end of year 15, then you refinance the chunk that is left. Then you amortize it over 30 years instead of 15 years. That could drop maybe your tariff by 30%. And that's a big impact actually on the population, on cost of electricity, on growth. As part of this Mission 300, can all the partners explore that option? Because the blended finance alone will not do it. That tenor has to move. Thank you.
Anyone?
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying that I do agree with you, Amadou. But for me, cost reflectivity is actually cost reflectivity. You either reflect all the costs that you have incurred and find ways of structuring them the way you are talking about. But if you think about it, when we develop the tariff methodologies for utilities, if you start from scratch, you will start with the generation. And I've done this before. I was privileged to have been involved in developing the tariff structure that sustained Kenya for about 20 years. It was the most profitable, sort of commercially viable utility for about 20 years. And we started simply by looking at your generation costs and identify the system marginal price of generation. You say this is what you look at, say 30 years, and you look at the progression of your demand, and then you say, how are you going to be able to meet this demand from a generation point of view? Then you look at, say, the next step is transmission. How will I be able to evacuate this capacity to the load centers and add all the costs that are associated with that and develop what you call the system marginal price for transmission? Do the same for distribution, and then you aggregate. But to address the issue of affordability, what you do is that you classify the various customer categories within, for example, residential costs. So you have lifeline customers, people who cannot afford a lot of the tariffs. And then you have the Amadous, the Andrews of this world who can slightly pay some more. And you cross-subsidize within those categories. And at the end of the day, the idea is, at the end of the day, you are able to project the amount of resources that you require to operate your power system. And then what you're saying is that the tariff will actually be recovering those costs over the long period of time. So I agree, as part of the reforms that we are doing, one of the things is how we can be able to bring in generation that is affordable. And those are some of the considerations that we are going to have. But the thing is, you need to understand is that government sometimes will there has to be an assessment of how enabling the environment is. Because if you make life difficult for the investors, and I always say this, sometimes you go to countries, and Joe and I were developers at one time, and they make you feel as if they are doing you a favor, as opposed to this is a mutually beneficial sort of mutually reinforcing or beneficial arrangement. Then there will be a problem, because there will be asymmetry in expectations. But if you address that, then you can be able to genuinely say, this is what we are looking for. We need to reflect the true cost of supply. How do we, without affecting the overall revenue waterfall, how are we able to meet the targets on tariffs, but also meet the requirements of tariff and therefore repayment to the developers? I'll stop there.
Joseph, you had a quick comment on this?
Yes. That is the old school way of thinking about this. Well, we've seen in some of the pilots we're doing, for example, in Ogun State with Dawe, and Rachel, I'm sure you can speak to this, is developers today of utilities, smaller utilities, and this was on Bloomberg, thanks to Ash and team for helping us communicate this particular model, is where you start with thinking about who are the consumers, what is the mix, and then from there you build a utility that's fit for purpose. If you try to do the modeling from the old way of looking at it, we're expecting that governments will be able to borrow to keep supporting these utilities, and that's not going to happen. The fiscal room doesn't allow for that. So we need to think about it from a different perspective, which is in the reality of today's Africa, PPAs are not going to be as common as they have been. We need to move towards thinking about these projects from a merchant plant perspective, and that requires regional integration so that an investor is not assessing the bankability of one country or another, but the demand of the power across a diversified pool of customers. The PPA approach is very challenging for governments because the expectation is they plan ahead and they commit to buying power at a certain tariff for 20 years. If they're not able to buy that power tomorrow because they don't have enough consumption, they're still stranded with, how do you call it? Deemed energy, which in Uganda, for example, it's costing them $10 to $15 million a year. And so in my view, I agree. In the old way of thinking about things, we had to look at all those metrics, but the way we need to start thinking about it is, are we investing and looking at the models correctly? I would also push us not to think about power plants as individual investments. We need to move to a scale where we're thinking about power plants along with the associated demand, because if you can only invest in the supply side, the country or the region doesn't have the economics to make this viable. But if you think of it holistically, you're building 10 megawatts for which there's local demand for that power in e-mobility, in other activities today that would not have been possible because of the electrification of the economies, then you're looking at how to solve the problem. And so in the spirit of challenging my colleagues, shall we move away from PPAs to thinking about electricity in a holistic way?
So wait, so I want to weigh in also, but Amadou wants to get another last word. I'll give it to you.
Yeah.
But also, there's a major piece that you didn't talk about, and I see colleagues from TCX in this room. It's not just the longer tenors, it's the currency. So it doesn't do you any good to have a 30-year tenor on a PPA if it's being financed in dollars when that local currency is going to depreciate by 95% against the US dollar over that 30-year period. Somebody needs to take on that currency risk because you're going to have to adjust the tariff as the currency continues to depreciate against the dollar, and it's something that we all need to look at. I'm going to let Rachel go, and then Amadou. You have another word.
Thank you so much. And
sorry, this is turning into a technical discussion, which isn't really what we offered up here, but let's have it. So.
But that's an important one. So, and you actually, that's one of the things that I wanted to mention. Is one, give an example. Let me start with that on what we see on the ground. So we have a distributed renewable energy platform. In there, we have very small projects that are some are still under construction, etc. But we've all have PPAs. Sorry, we haven't moved away from that are cost reflective, in spite of having people within that community that are not necessarily able to pay immediately. But what we've seen, and that is in Nigeria, and we all know what happened with the currency, right? We had to double the tariff, essentially, and we didn't know what the response would be. What has happened is that increased cost has been absorbed, but it took a few months for the users to adjust in terms of their purchasing power. But what was interesting is that in speaking with them, you're realizing that with the power that is being provided, they're actually setting up businesses. They're actually trading. They're actually now better able to farm their produce and sell it at a better price because there's less waste thanks to the cold value chain, et cetera, et cetera. So their ability to pay has increased as a result of having had the electricity, which is now a virtuous circle where they are able to pick up the increased tariff. Granted, Nigeria is a very peculiar country where the alternative is diesel generating, which is 3 times more expensive than what the solar energy could provide. And I think maybe that's the great opportunity, is that you now have renewable energy that has become so cheap that is displacing, with no competition in terms of cost, the diesel or the fossil fuel generated. And that has been a blessing. And when you know that in Lagos alone, you have an estimated 80 to 100 gigawatts of self-generating capacity, you can imagine what the impact of that would be. And so far, should it be on the CNI side or on the distributed renewable side, we have on the distributed renewable side, we haven't had an issue with invoice being paid at cost-reflective tariff. It's just been a delay.
Okay. We are over time. I know a lot of people have wanted to ask questions. I would encourage people to continue the conversation outside there or have some conversations right here. But want to thank everybody for coming. And this is just the start of the conversation. So thank you.